Hey, we are good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geoff Huston. I am the Chief Scientist at APNIC. And we've organised a panel session this afternoon for you with the assistance of George Michelson back in Brisbane. Hello, George. And a number of other folk who I'll introduce shortly. The topic is all about satellites and satellite broadband. And I'll lay the scene a little bit, if you will, because I'm sure you're all too young. None of you would actually remember, so I had to look it up myself. It was the 4th of October 1957 when the Russians successfully launched Sputnik into orbit. You couldn't see it, it was just basically the size of a soccer ball. But if you're a ham radio enthusiast, you could hear it go bleep. Now, the Russians thought this was great. The Americans thought, oh my God, we've lost the space race before it even started. And it actually incented the Americans to massively ramp up their own program. And it was under the Kennedy administration that this really took an enormous amount of momentum. But it was interesting because the Kennedy administration took the decision that space was not meant to be the subject of privatised exploration and exploitation. President Kennedy and his administration were convinced that space should be above such tawdry business concerns and should be basically national investments and national programs rather than commercial. The Americans and the Russians both went very, very hard through the 1960s, and it was probably one of the biggest leaps of technology in terms of development of particular technologies to actually complete Kennedy's promise of having a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Some of the outcomes? Well, Velcro. The world would be without Velcro were it not for NASA's work in this area and many, many other things. So the amount of money the Americans poured into NASA was amazing. The feat was amazing. If you look at the computers at the time, even getting a spacecraft up above the atmosphere, you'd have to say was a miracle. They didn't lose many astronauts, which was an even bigger miracle. They got to the moon by the end of the 60s, and everyone was very pleased, but the more missions they launched, the less people looked at it. And so the last mission, down here, was Apollo 17 in December 1972. Just 3 years after the first moon landing in '69, 4 years. So in some ways it was a brief renaissance of actually doing manned missions. And even the launch vehicles that we used, which were enormous, Saturn V's and so on, we stopped making them. And after a few years, we probably never knew how to build them again. Satellites continued, but they continued in terms of predominantly geostationary systems. Systems that went right up, and I'll explain that in a second, right up to a position where they're fixed in the sky. They're expensive. They were hideously expensive. Only newspapers and television stations could afford to use them. The rest of us could lease tiny circuits at enormous price, and that was the situation for years, until. So let's sort of look at this in a bit of detail here, and to discuss this in some detail as to where we are today and why, I'm joined with 4 others who the joining is reminiscent of COVID times. None of them are here. It's all remote. I've got Zoom in front of me. And so I've got Dan York from the Internet Society, Dr. Ulrich Spiedel from the University of Auckland, Mike Puchol from Power Internet, and Deepapam Bandachi, I believe. Have I got that right? I hope so. I really do. I can see you there. Each of those will give us, around 10 to 12 minutes, and we'll have time for questions with each of them because we've got 90 minutes. But I'd like to spend just a tiny bit of time setting the scene for everyone. So if I can just go to the slide pack here, which should be on the screen now, please, and quickly go through some of these introductory points. The first real question is, why bother? It's a damn fine question. If you actually take some of these current maps of undersea cable systems, around this region, there is no shortage of fibre on the submarine, on the seafloor. This is a map from Telegeography, and most of these systems have been put in the last 20 years, I guess. And as you see, all the way through from India, up along the coast in the South China Sea, past Vietnam, past China, Japan, and across the northern Pacific, and another cable nexus point at Guam joining to Hawaii, there is an awful lot of capacity. Each of these cables 30 odd years ago was lucky if you get 500 megabits per second. Current cables, 500 terabits per second. You don't need more capacity, or if you do, I don't know what the hell you're doing, because this is an enormous amount of abundance of capacity. So why do we even think there's a market niche satellite? Is there not enough capacity under the ocean? No, huge amount. But there are some deep issues down there, unbelievably. Geology is a real problem. If you actually look closely, just south of the island of Taiwan is the Luzon Strait. And it's one of the few places you can get from the inner part of Asia across into the Pacific Ocean. It's also a plate zone. It's also a area. So it's prone to submarine landslides. Now, a landslide on Earth is kind of scary. A landslide under sea travels down the slope at about 300 kilometres an hour. It's really bad, and you don't want to be anywhere near it. And if there's any submarine cable there, it's gone. So geology is a problem. A lot of geology. Also, shallow water is a problem, and the entire South China Sea is not exactly deep water. Shallow water can get anchors, can get all kinds of things happening to it. So around the South China Sea, and of course the landing points at Singapore, dead set shallow. So even Hong Kong is not the best of landing points because of the enormous amount of shipping. We've also got, as I said, the active plate boundaries, and last and not least is a certain amount of, well, political tension. In a previous APNIC meeting, I think it was, we heard about the new politics of submarine cables in this region. If you want to land your cable in the United States, or Guam, or Hawaii, that cable cannot also land in China or Hong Kong, or even traverse the South China Sea anymore. So all of a sudden, there are a whole bunch of constraints around these cables that we had never guessed was going to happen. And so this system, while it might look like a rich system, is actually full of a set of constraints. A second massive submarine landslide in the Luzon Strait would again cause the same disruptions as it caused about, I think it was 10 years ago. Any of those issues could cause havoc. So you can see that if you really want to never fail, you've got to think a little harder. And one of the ways of thinking is to look up. You may have seen this, it's a very popular slide. It's actually the Earth and the various orbital satellites in scale. There's kind of two areas of real interest in this. All the way, that way over there. All the way out here is this very special area where if you launch a spacecraft at that particular altitude, it orbits at the same speed as the Earth's rotation. So if you look it up, it's always there. You don't need to track it. The only thing that makes it wobble is the moon, as long as it's got a bit of station keeping fuel. That's brilliant, but it's a long way away. The next bit down here is the so-called Van Allen belt. Up there is a lot of solar radiation. You really need to sort of coat things with enough insulation, and you can't use very narrow track electronics because solar radiation will kill it. But down here, under the Van Allen belt, it's almost as good as Earth. You've got a lot of protection from solar radiation, but you can't go too low, because if you get too low, you start to graze the Earth's atmosphere and you start to burn up and die. So just above the Earth's atmosphere and just below the bottom part of the Van Allen belt is this kind of sweet spot where you've got a huge amount of protection from radiation, and you can actually put a satellite up there and it kind of works. It's very close. You can even get there with handheld electronics, and it'll stay up there for quite some years as long as you just don't leave it alone. So these are the two areas of interest, the LEOs and the GEOs. The GEOs, the exact height is 37,786 kilometres. At the speed of light, 300,000 kilometres a second, that still takes a bit of time to get there and back. A round trip time against a geostationary satellite is around 2/3 of a second to go up and down and up and down. So compared to what you're used to with fibre, you need to be a bit patient, and your protocols need to be a bit patient. This is a map from Boeing about what's up there. It's regulated by treaty, by an IT, in fact a UN body, ITUT I think, and every country has a right to a small number of slots separated, if I remember correctly, at around 2 degrees of angle across that entire area. It's equatorial. So most countries have a right to a small number of slots, and most of them have something up there in some form. So if you put something up there, you either have a slot or you can't, and if you've already got something there, it's got to go away before you can put something else there. There's a certain limit to the number of geostationary satellites you can have up there at that altitude. Big dishes, it's a long way away. So when you look at Earth station equipment, this is not mucking around. This is not just a little laptop and a tiny antenna. Normally it's a relatively large dish tracking this. As I said, limited slots, limited frequency allocation. So generally there's not a huge amount of capacity up there. And of course, the 2/3 of a second round trip time stresses most protocols. So you've actually got to do a little bit of understanding and engineering about long delay, and 2/3 of a second is long in anyone's language, getting capacity out of long delay circuitry. But each of those geostationaries can see an entire hemisphere. So what you actually get on most of these is a variety of transmitters. So when it's up there, it'll have a number of spot beams, which concentrates on major population centres, and what we call a hemispherical transponder, which actually gives you the entire hemisphere. And you can book circuitry, dedicated circuitry, such that you beam up and it will beam down to either a particular location under the spot beam, or you'll get an allocation under the hemispherical transponder. Traditionally, they were incredibly expensive. I still think they are now, but prices come down because there are so many alternatives. But for a while, they were the only way of getting around, so they were hideously expensive. GEOs are still with us, they're still up there, predominantly used for television these days as far as I can tell, although a small number of data services are being used, but more of a specialised area than general. Low Earth orbit is where the interest is. It all started, actually, as far as I can see, with Motorola's Iridium project. Now, that was never a salutary lesson. They spent $30 billion launching a constellation of low Earth orbiting satellites. Even before they'd finished, because a whole bunch of countries refused to give them spectrum license, they knew it was a dud. And even before they finished, they were figured out they were going to go bankrupt, and they were actually planning, if there wasn't a buyer, that they were going to burn the entire constellation up in the Earth's atmosphere and walk away. The US decided that they would prompt folk to rescue it, and the $30 billion project was bought for $30 million, a bargain price, and Iridium still lives. There was enough station-keeping fuel on each of these spacecraft that it's still up there and flying. Very, very limited bandwidth. Services are basically around, I think it's G624, it's 6 kilobits or so on per channel. So it's almost like a voice system in the sky. It's not real broadband. But it served purpose. It made global phoning work, global phones, handsets work for the first time. And that was kind of the forerunner. But more recently, what we've seen, of course, is different uses because of a change in launch cost. Every single rocket went up and burned up. So every launch was really expensive. And it wasn't until SpaceX and Elon Musk that the whole idea of a reusable launch vehicle came along. As soon as you can reuse the launch vehicle, the entire cost of putting something up there plummeted. And SpaceX's work in that space has been totally revolutionary. The satellites are close, 550 kilometres. So when they look down, they don't see a hemisphere. They see, well, it's bigger than a city, but not by much. So to cover a large area, you need a lot. And at that kind of altitude, 500 kilometres, they really are whizzing through the sky. 1 degree of movement, 1 degree of arc per second. So you need active tracking to actually track each spacecraft as it whizzes overhead. And somehow, if you want to continue a service, you've got to track and switch as you switch from spacecraft to satellite as it moves overhead. So you need a large constellation to do continuous service. And of course, like Iridium found, every single terrestrial operator views satellites with hatred, fear, disgust, loathing. They see it as competition, because their fear is that these low orbiting systems have a global reach. And if they make all their money over the rich markets of Europe and America, when they're circling over developing countries, they could sell the service for any price they want. It makes no difference. And so they saw this as the ultimate erosion of the value of terrestrial-based services. And so getting spectrum licenses to operate has always been a massive hurdle for these kinds of enterprises. And even today, not that many countries actually have licenses to allow Starlink to operate. Australia, Chile, the United States, I think France, and maybe others. I'm not sure, I haven't looked lately. But it's not a big list because of this issue that they see this as a threat, so there are many regulatory hurdles. So the one in the news, the one everyone knows about, is of course Starlink. Currently, in the last week or two, he's got 3,773 of these. Each launch carries a huge stack of them. They're tiny things, size of a shoebox, and they're about 35 in a canister. They release it, starts whizzing around, they spread out. There's a really cool website. It's there, satellite-map.space, which actually gives you a live animation of where every single one of these things are today. It's worth looking at. I could look at it for hours. It's not a full polar orbit. They actually incline the orbit, and a few of the spacecraft move into polar, but most of them are sitting there at a 53-degree inclination. So they cover where there's population, they don't cover the poles. They are retail. They are directly marketing to you and I in the countries where it's allowed to be. So you can buy it, I can buy it if you're in that country. What's coming with this service is the so-called version 2. Bigger, heavier, more power, but laser. And they're doing inter-satellite communication to laser. So what we'll be able to do, rather than just floating a mirror above the sky, where you and the Earth station need to be within sight of this spacecraft, which means the coverage is dependent as much on the Earth stations as it is on where you are and where the satellite is. Once you start doing laser switching, you can bring up the signal over the Philippines and bring it down in America. And you go, well, okay, I can do that on fibre. But the speed of a signal through space on laser is the speed of light. The speed of a signal through fibre is 2/3 of the speed of light. And so if you think about it, if the Hibernia transatlantic submarine cable was based on a business case of being just 9 milliseconds faster than all the other transatlantic submarine cables, what would happen if you bring up a transatlantic service on this system that's not just 9 milliseconds faster, maybe 10, maybe 15? And you kind of go, what the hell? But if I'm a stock market day trader trading on margins of milliseconds, I'm at the door banging it down going, give me everything you've got, I want it. Because this stuff can be fast. Because that linkage through space is so much faster than the linkage across with fibre. So that's the interest in V2 as much as anything else. I'm no longer constrained as to where the Earth stations are. But it's not all clear sailing. Another project called OneWeb is polar orbits. LESS 542 went bankrupt. and has been salvaged predominantly by a bunch of Europeans, including the UK government. They're higher, 1,200 kilometres, and they just haven't managed to make a retail model work, so they're aiming at business and government services rather than a straight retail offering. Someone's disagreeing with me, are they? Sorry. The last and not least has just got regulatory approval in the United States, I believe, although approval's a funny thing to talk about, which is Amazon's Project Kuiper. Still in planning, but still going through the hurdles in the courts, 3,276 satellites, much the same altitude as Starlink, just a little bit higher. 3 altitude levels, as you see there, and they too are planning to go straight into retail. The Chinese say they're doing something, but that's all they're saying at this point that the rest of us understand. It's likely they will, and there may be others. LEOs are a big money play. It's expensive. Even if you've got reusable launch vehicles, it's expensive. And if you can't really get into the high value markets, you're probably going to go the fate of Iridium. You're probably going to lose your money. You need to make incursions into the existing broadband market if you're going to survive. And Iridium is a big lesson here. And OneWeb has already gone bankrupt. So the real question is this just national chest beating? Am I doing it because I can? Because I'm a billionaire with too much money? Or is there a real service kicking around here? Can it scale? Can it work? Is this something that we should be able to rely on in the future as being one more way of connecting the world? So today, as I've already said, Dan York from ISOC with an overview of the issues, Mike from Africa Rural and Remote, get this in the right order. Ulrich is after Dan, and then Mike, and then Debapan Batterjee from Microsoft Research. So without further ado, Dan York is not with us at the moment, but we'll get Dan's presentation played through. You're welcome to ask questions afterwards, just state your name at the mic, and I will do my best impersonation of Dan York and try and answer him or tell some lies. Thanks. Over to Dan.
Hello, Apricot 2023 attendees. My name is Dan York with the Internet Society, and I'm pleased to come to you and speak a bit about what the work we did in 2022 around low Earth orbit satellites. I regret I can't attend in person. It's a vacation week for me, but I'm delighted that Geoff and George allowed me to send in a video and perhaps help frame the discussion. I think you've got an excellent panel. I look forward to watching the recording as we go from there. So we at the Internet Society believe that the Internet is for everyone, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we connect the unconnected. Well, LEOs, or LEOs, however you wish to say it, low Earth orbit satellites, seem to have tremendous potential, and we want to understand more about what is all of that that's going on there. Now, you can't escape the hype. The marketing is all around in so many ways. We hear all of that. There's also a great amount of interest, I think, because traditional satellites, geostationary satellites, that have provided internet access for a couple of decades, have a challenge that it takes a long time to get all the way from Earth out to a geosynchronous orbit at 36,000 kilometers and back, at least 600 milliseconds, if not much higher. And when video calls kind of don't work after about 150 milliseconds or so, you need something with lower latency. So LEO's systems are much closer to the Earth, and they're able to provide that kind of low latency, high speed connectivity. Is it as fast as fiber? Well, probably not typically, but it can be fast enough to enable us to do video calls, streaming, all of the things that we want to do in this kind of day and age. Here's a bit of a picture of what it looks like. All the way out on the right is the geosynchronous orbit. Right down close to the Earth, under 2,000, is the low Earth orbit, or LEO. And that's where all these constellations are, and it's where the space stations are. It's where so much is that's happening in that space. In between, there is a medium Earth orbit, or MEO. And in fact, there are solutions out in that space, and there are multi-orbit constellations coming along that use GEO, MEO, and LEO all together in some way. The basic idea, of course, is the farther you out you are, the fewer satellites you need. You can do geosynchronous satellites, and you could use 3 to provide access around the entire world. Whereas LEOs need more like this. They need hundreds to thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth in order to provide the connectivity that they want. Now, the other part of the interest in LEOs is because we are seeing advances in rocket technology. You see companies like SpaceX that can reuse the rockets many times. You see the mass production of satellites to be able to go and stamp them out and send them off. You have all of this happening in different ways. And there's so much activity in the space. Here's just a glimpse of what happens in the next several years. Starlink, SpaceX is finishing their Gen 1, their first generation shell. They're starting already to launch into their Generation 2 shell. OneWeb will be completing its constellation. Amazon plans to launch its Project Kuiper satellites. China's got a constellation of 13,000 satellites they're looking to launch. And the EU just announced a new constellation they're looking to get up into space by 2026, I think. So a lot happening, and the numbers are huge. You know, SpaceX has already 44, or is on its path to 4,400 satellites. Then they've got this Gen 2, which will be 30,000. Now, they're only approved for 7,500, but their goal is to get to 30,000. You know, OneWeb, Amazon, China, you know, all of these are out there. If we do the math, conceivably, we could have 60,000, maybe even 90,000 satellites. And that's before the proposal coming out of Rwanda from a company called eSpace to launch 337,000 satellites. A lot happening out there. Now let's talk about the components that make up a system. The constellation we've already talked about. There's also a user terminal, which is, you could think of it as the antenna, but they don't look like the dish antennas anymore. They're more like pizza boxes that are electronically steerable so they could be able to go and track multiple satellites. And then there's the ground stations that connect you to the rest of the internet. A typical operation would look like this. Your user terminal would connect up to a satellite in LEO and go down to a ground station. It probably looks a lot more like this, where you can use multiple satellites and work with it in that way. So this is how it may operate. Now, one interesting aspect that you have around these is so-called inter-satellite links, or laser links, lasers in space, whatever, where you can connect up from your user terminal to a LEO satellite, go across the constellation, and then drop down to a ground station. Some amazing capabilities that we're looking at in different ways. You know, a lot of people looking at caching and edge computing, just amazing technology. Our question back in 2022 was, are these good for the open internet? Are they just okay, or are they, bad for the open internet? We wrote a document. You can get it at internetsociety.org/LEOs, and you can read our perspectives on what this is all about and the questions we think should be debated at panels like this and in other places around the world. I'll give you a spoiler that we don't really know. There's so much new. All of that, those lists I showed you, are still being launched. So we have so many questions that are out there. The opportunities are clear. It can be life-changing connectivity for people. It can totally change the game on disaster connectivity. It can provide Wi-Fi or cellular connectivity to people using backhaul up to these systems. Tremendous opportunity. Amazing. But there's certainly challenges. First of all, getting your satellites up into space, right? If you're SpaceX and you also have a rocket company as part of you, you can do that. But if you're other companies, you're trying to get launch capacity all around the world in different ways. You're also building those user terminals, getting licenses with ground stations, and getting the regulatory approvals to use it. You need to get spectrum allocations, get your terminals approved, landing rights. It's crazy, all the different things they have to do to open up each and every individual country. Some real challenges too around affordability. Will people who need these systems the most actually be able to afford them? We don't know. We don't know. It's an open answer. Will they have the capacity to be able to actually handle the traffic we need? And I'm glad you have Mike on this panel, because he's done some great independent research around this, because we don't know. If we start connecting every device we have, if we start to give preference to space, space-based internet access versus our land-based, will it be able to do it all? We just don't know. What about competition, consolidation? Lots of questions here. Policy issues. The spectrum allocation is a big one. I mentioned, I was speaking at the Armenian Internet Governance Forum in December of 2022, and the main regulator was there on stage, and somebody asked him, when will we get Starlink in Armenia? And he said, it'll be a long time. It turns out they use the same frequency Starlink needs for their military and their national security. They can't move that very easily, and yes, they could share it, but you wind up with interference issues, which won't make it work as well. Lots of things that have to be talked about. For people to be, if you're not aware, there is the World Radio Congress happening later this year in Dubai under the auspices of the International Telecommunications Union. There'll be a lot of discussion there around how do the spectrum, how does this all work? There's certainly technology issues. A big one, I think, for us is around interoperability and wondering, are we going to be building, probably, multiple different sets of different non-connected equipment up there? Or will we have ways to have a truly resilient network that's interoperable? These are questions we need to be asking the vendors and operators in different ways. Space debris, obviously, is a huge one. Space weather, lots of questions around that. And there's many questions we simply can't answer. We don't know if all of these business models are going to be sustainable. We may not know until they go on up there. The environmental impact. It's an open question here because all of these satellites have about a 5-year lifespan and they need to deorbit, as they say, and burn up in the upper atmosphere. If we're launching 60,000 satellites, we pretty much have to be continuously launching replacements. And that's maybe 20, 40, 50 a day that'll be burning up in the upper atmosphere. Do we know if that's a good thing? I don't know. All of these are questions that we need to ask and have answered. I'll put in one little plug to say that we have an Internet Society Foundation, isocfoundation.org, which will have an opening of a research round in April. And I've talked to folks there that they'd be very interested in getting proposals around research into LEOs and particularly environmental aspects and other elements. With that, I'm going to say there's so much potential. I think we all have to ask these questions around how do we shape the future of these LEO internet access. We need panels like this. We need discussions. We offer our paper as a discussion point. I hope some of you will download it, take a look, and keep asking these questions. With that, I'll say thank you very much. You can reach me at york@isoc.org, and I look forward to listening to your panel. Best wishes, all of you.
Thank you, Dan. As I said, he is not with us online, I believe. So if you have any questions for Dan right now, I will do poor impersonation of trying to answer them. Probably won't work. But if there are any questions, now is a good time. No. We will move on. And the next speaker I've got here in my order is Ulrich from the University of Auckland, Dr. Ulrich Spiedel, on Pacific experiences with satellite services. So I will hand the control of Zoom over to you. You can run your own slides, or if you want us to do it, let us know. Unmuting would be good. I've still got.
Yeah, sorry for not being unmuted. I was just trying to screen share here, and it hides the unmute button when you try and do that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Geoff. So just bear with me for a moment. I also hope it's going to hold up. I had a conference a little while ago when I was trying to use PowerPoint as a virtual background, where it would basically crash on me. So we're just going to go and quickly go to, where's it all? Okay, so just bear with me on this until it's up and running. So yeah, just so my video seems to have just while
Are those slides coming from us? Oh, okay, so we can see your slides, Ulrich.
okay, can you hear me?
almost there.
Okay.
How's
Okay.
it going, because we can move on to the next speaker and come back to you. The moment your picture is freezing. And there is no audio. Okay, I'm going to turn this back to the audio folk to debug, Ulrich. So
yeah, apologies, it's kicking me out. So could you run my slides, please?
On at this point to the next speaker. Mike, hello. Mike Puchol, who's going to talk about Africa, rural and remote.
Geoff, I'm actually here.
If that's okay, Mike, it's all yours. Again, we can do the slides if you want, but if you want to share your screen, that's great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'll go ahead and share.
We can hear you. We can see it. Thank you.
And you can see the slides. Perfect. Perfect. So give a bit of background. I'll start with I've been operating in Africa for approximately 7 years now, and this deck is a bit of a recollection of some of the lessons learned, combined with the topic of this panel. I'll start with, and the question, are we there yet, is to tie in with the previous presenters' comments around we don't really know whether LEOs are actually going to be a viable solution for some of the challenges we face in these markets and these areas. And I'll start with the question that we or the statement that we very often see of connecting the unconnected. We see this statement all the time. There are so many people trying to address this issue and to connect the unconnected, the people that don't have any internet access. But my experience has been that there seems to be a fairly narrow view in most cases of what this actually means, because it's not about building sea cables, it's not about launching satellites, it's not about laying fiber. There's so many elements in the whole technology stack and the whole value chain and the whole financial stack that need to align in order to reach everyone, that the different consideration needs to be made. If we just Googled connecting the unconnected, we would see we get about 3 million results. And if you start browsing some of them, you see some very, very big heavyweight organizations and companies that have programs for connecting the unconnected, bridging the digital divide and addressing the problem of people not being online yet. According to Telefonica, this is the sort of heat map of people not using the internet. So we can see that in Africa, there's about 75% of people don't use the internet. Asia and Pacific, 58%. So there is a significant amount of population in these areas that still don't use the internet. And of course, if you look at the Americas, there's 35%, and that's why one of the primary markets of LEO constellations is the US and Europe, because there's still areas where people don't use the internet. Depending on who you read and what your sources are, there's about 4 billion people. We have 4 billion unconnected people. If we apply a bit of marketing and pricing that you see in shops, we can make it look a little less bad. So we'll just take one off, and that seems slightly better. But I sometimes get confused, and I just don't understand why so much money, so many big organizations trying to address this problem, and we still haven't really made a dent. There's still so many people offline and not able to use the internet, and we all know that the internet is an enabler, as is sanitation and healthcare and education. We have this vicious circle between supply and demand. So the people that need to build the infrastructure say, well, I don't have any demand. Why should I invest and provide the supply? Because I'm not going to see returns in a long time. In Western markets, let's just say, if you make an investment of $1 billion, you can say, okay, I can expect a return in 2 years, and then I start making a profit. But in some of these markets, the path to profitability and to break even is a lot less clear. Which brings us is, if we zoom in a bit more into this vicious circle, and I just picked these blocks out of the very, very complex equation. So there's a lot more issues, but if we just take these to go through the argument, we have long haul IP that needs to be delivered to a continent or a country. We then have local loop to deliver internet through the country. We have middle mile and last mile, last inch, which is where the fiber operators then offer service to individual customers and businesses. We also have regulatory aspects, which have been alluded to. And then we have all other stuff, and we'll see what that means. If we go with the first one, we take any of these submarine cables, the To Africa cable that's is a Facebook/Meta project, is going to have 180 terabits of per second of capacity around Africa, and it's going to land in several places. And you'd say, okay, that's awesome capacity. But if we take the narrow view, and engineers like myself usually do this, is okay, there you go, sea cable, it's on the shore, here's your pop, fine, we're done. We scratch that one. We have now a few less unconnected because we've just landed a submarine cable. If we take the next one, which is the sort of local loop, middle mile and last mile, operators such as Seacom, this is their map of connectivity within Kenya. There's a lot of fiber in Kenya, so there isn't a lack of sort of broad fiber connectivity and local loop, which feeds mobile networks as well, and fiber operators such as Safaricom. So there is fiber in some of these countries. So you can scratch that one as well. We have connected a few more unconnected. So we dropping the number, good. We have operators such as ourselves and Safaricom and others providing last mile and last inch. Regulation around fiber is fairly simple, fairly clear. You can get licenses in these countries, so that's not a big issue. But then we get into all the other stuff, such as your water company randomly digging the main road between Mombasa and Nairobi, where all the fiber cables go through. And this particular one took out Airtel, the entire Airtel network in the whole of Kenya for 8 hours, and affected several operators. We have infrastructure issues. We have weather causing problems. We have UV radiation breaking Ethernet cables and causing water to seep in. And this is the local solution for that, which is to break a bit of the sleeve and then just allow the water to drip out, hopefully not on top of the rack that hosts the equipment. And let's just say the amount of unstructured cabled and traditional crimping that goes on is also significant. So this makes for a very, very not scalable and not very easily maintainable infrastructure, which means that you need to replace fiber cables, you need to replace a lot of the infrastructure very often because it gets damaged, it gets cut, it gets treated like this. And there's just different ways of doing things, and you know, why should I buy a socket when I can just shove the cables in? We're back to square one, almost. Then some people started asking, so what if we use satellites for, you know, to deal with all this other stuff and all these issues? And Geoff gave a very, very good historical background into where we're at today. If we started using satellites, we could say, okay, we've basically taken out a few of the items in the local loop. We can go directly to customer. We can remove middle mile and last mile inch. We still need long haul IP to deliver to the ground stations that have been alluded to in the previous presentations, and we still need some local loop to finally reach those ground stations. So it's not like we don't need any fiber. Somewhere you need to land your traffic from the satellites down to Earth. But we can say, okay, last mile, last inch. all that goes away because we now can deliver directly to the customers without having all these fiber networks. We still have regulation, so you still need licenses, and all of the stuff is still there. If we if we zoom back and take a look at what geo operators are doing to combat some of the threats that were also alluded to by Dan and Geoff, the Viasat, for example, is launching Viasat 3, which is a constellation of 3 satellites, 1 terabit per second per satellite in geostationary orbit as a growth path to basically get more capacity into these constellations. If we take 3 Viasats, 3 terabits per second, we have 4 billion unconnected. We could basically deliver 750 bits per second to every one of those unconnected people on the planet. If we provision 1.5 Mbps per unconnected person, which is what we do, so every one of our customer gets 1.5 Mbps provision capacity, we hardly make a dent. If we look at the financials and we take a typical revenue of $12.50 per subscription, which is what we charge our customers in Kenya, that would result in $25 million a month. But the cost of a Viasat 3 satellite of the Viasat 3 system is 3.3 billion. So you're looking at 8 years to pay back the cost of the satellites. So unless the satellites live for longer than 8 years, then you're never going to make your money back. And as a result, this is my friend, the CFO at Viasat, not liking this. And we have Elon that came in and said, okay, what if we do something different? Let's look at this LEO segment of the Earth, and you've seen this one a few times already, so I'll skip on it. And you've seen a version of this as well, which is the number of people launching satellites into the number of broadband internet constellations. So quite a lot of them. And yes, we can plug Starlink. A big fat bold disclaimer is that I am a Starlink fan from the point of view that they do things very, very differently from traditional satellite operators. Very quick example: they don't build their satellites in clean rooms. And there's a quote that goes something like this: if a fingernail falls into one of our satellites and we're sending a bit of DNA into space, that's fine as long as it doesn't short circuit one of the PCBs. So they do things a lot differently. Traditional satellite manufacturing is done in very, very large clean rooms, very, very expensive processes. They've basically done so many things so differently that I am hopeful that they will be successful, and I do think that they are a credible constellation. But I have no vested interest. I have nothing other than I think it's very, very cool tech, and I am a nerd. Gen 1 constellation has been mentioned before. We have about 20 gigabit per second per satellite, with an aggregate of 88 terabits per second. If we look at Viasat 3, that was 3 terabits per second, so already a significant increase in capacity. If we plug these numbers back into the calculations we did earlier, we're still not making such a big dent. We're maybe 176 million people we could connect. But the issue with there are some caveats around LEO constellations. Capacity is evenly spread, which means your satellites are sort of all constantly moving, and you have these regions, for example, very large oceans where you've got all this capacity that is flying over them, but it's not being able to be used because there may be a ship in the middle of there somewhere consuming some internet, but there's not large bodies of population. So the capacity is actually evenly spread, which means it's hard to actually concentrate it and make it useful in specific regions. The lifespan of a satellite is about 5 years. So again, as been mentioned, you need to constantly be replacing satellites, and the entire build cost for this constellation is estimated at 10 billion, and maybe more. You also need gateways to offload traffic to terrestrial networks. As mentioned, satellites are always moving, which means that you need a more complex user terminal. I will now refer to the website that I built, and this was a personal project for basically learn about how Starlink operates and how it functions. And as an operator in Africa, looking at these constellations, the question is, are they credible? Can they provide capacity? Will they be able to deliver the capacity that we need for backhaul services, for example, in a place like Kenya? And the only way to do that was to create a tool which didn't really exist at the time, or if there were, they were very expensive commercial tools, and we're a low-cost operator. So I built this site and I made it public so that I could get other people that are way more knowledgeable than me on these matters to contribute and to feedback and to tell me where I was doing things wrong. And this is a simulation of capacity in the Philippines, and we can see that I mean what we're representing here is the satellites that are able to cover the area with their spot beams. The green lines are the spot beams from the satellites, and then the color of the cells is a representation of the between maximum, which is green, and minimum, which is red. How much capacity is every one of these cells getting? If you look at the top left, we can see that we have about 1,100 cells, and we are using 22 satellites to cover these cells, and the total capacity that this system could deliver is about 440 gigabits per second, and with a maximum capacity per cell of 2.6 gigabits per second. Now, if we provision 2 megabits per second, we could serve about 220,000 user terminals on the ground. Of course, there are caveats to this. If you wanted to service Vietnam, Cambodia, some of these satellites would need to divert resources to those other markets. So you wouldn't get the full capacity allocated just to your country. So this is the best case scenario. If we zoom in a bit more, we can select an individual cell, and we can see the different satellites serving these cells and what capacity from every spot beam is actually delivered to these cells. And zooming in a bit more, I actually fed population densities into each of these cells, so you can actually see that this cell has a population of 16,000 people and would have an individual capacity of about 300 Mbps with 5 spot beams from 5 different satellites. Now, if we talk to the user terminals that you need for these constellations, if you go on a ship or see a ship of almost any kind, you will see these dome antennas that get installed on them. Now, inside these radomes, you have these satellite dishes on gimbals and motors, and they constantly move as the ship moves to track the geostationary satellites. Some operators, such as OneWeb, also use these dishes. So you have these mechanically steered antennas inside these domes, and you have 2 because when the satellite is in the path of the big mast in the middle, you're basically breaking the connection. So you need the other dish to take over and point at the satellite without the obstruction from the structures of the ship. So very complex, very expensive. I was at the Mobile World Congress yesterday, and I got a quote for one of these for about $15,000. So definitely not cheap, not for home use. What Starlink did is they manufactured their own electronically steered antenna, which uses phased array technologies to effectively remove the mechanical complexity. They still have motors in these antennas. My prediction is that they have actually come up with antennas without motors already. The reason for steering the antennas is that you still have certain things such as a protection around the geostationary belt, which Starlink cannot use. So they steer mechanically the antenna once when you power it up to move the field of view of the antenna away from the geostationary belt and concentrate on the satellites that you can actually use. All of this you can also see in the Starlink.sx site, by the way. So it's a much more complex antenna from an electronics point of view, but it's much simpler from a mechanical point of view. The current cost of these antennas is probably around $1,000, and they subsidize this. They are charging $400 to $500 to the end customer, which is still expensive for these development markets. They will have customers in Kenya, so flower farms, plantation owners, And these sort of customers will definitely use this, but not the bottom of the pyramid, and the people that we're targeting with $12 internet will not be able to afford these. If we talk financials again, the capex for SpaceX to deliver 221,000 user terminals to cover the country would be about 221 million at $1,000 cost per antenna, and every customer would need to pay $500 off that to get their own terminal. And this is where we get into another idea that we could have, which is, what if we share infrastructure? If instead of providing 221,000 user terminals, we started plugging 100 customers into every user terminal, SpaceX would only need to spend 2.2 million to serve this country, and the cost per user connected would be $5, because we're spreading $500 over 100 customers. Now, how do we do this? You let people use their skills. This is not photoshopped. This is actually, it's actually someone in the front riding the motorbike, so don't get worried. And if we go back to this picture, we find these things all the time in places like Kenya, where people basically use their skills, their imagination, whatever tools they have on hand, whatever bits of scrap they can find, and they actually provide internet service to people. And they are grabbing a fiber from Safaricom somewhere, and they are then throwing cables over walls, and they're coming up with these concoctions, but they actually do provide service to people. And who are we to judge? Who are we to say you need structured cabling, you need highly complex rack systems, and you need all this very, very expensive infrastructure? And we call this jua kali, which is Swahili for made from bits of stick. So who are we to say that this is not actually a valid way of delivering internet? And does it scale? Can you jua kali things and scale to these slums? Maybe not at macro level, but possibly at micro level, so local. There are some other issues. I'll quickly skip through these. Lack of power infrastructure is still an issue. We have microgrid companies fixing that. We have issues like devices, IT skills. People still don't know what the internet is for, so we still need to address quite a lot of these other issues. We even considered giving people dial-up and CompuServe as a starting point, because this is how we, some of you may remember this is how we grew up getting into the internet. So there's a lot of work to be done. And the question, are we there yet? Possibly getting there. I think LEOs will definitely play a big part in fixing these connectivity issues that we have. And I'll pass it back to Geoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was brilliant. Thank you. Love those images. We're
intended for recreational vehicles out into the field. We can't actually try much out from our campus as such, because it's pretty built up and there are a few places with a good view of the sky these days. So we got ourselves one of those portable power stations with a lithium battery in it that'll power Starlink for a few hours. And we set out with a small group of students on a very windy day to Bastion Point, which is a big park a few kilometers from the Auckland city centre, with very few obstructions in any direction. Now, two of the folks at the back of this picture here, where we set up our table, are people you might actually recognize. To the left is my former PhD student, Edward Cocker, who you might know as an APNIC community trainer, and also a former PIC ISOC chair. and who just happened to be in Auckland on business that day with a few hours to spare. In the middle is Wayne Ryer, my current PhD student, whom you might have come across as National Director of ICT in Kiribati. So now we got one of those newer rectangular units, and this is essentially what the box looks like, and this is what it looks like inside. So that X-shaped thing is in fact the foot. The white thing is the back of the antenna, which actually contains all of the transmitter and receiver electronics as well. It's known as Dishy McFlatface, or Dishy for short, and it's not actually a dish. It's a phased array antenna. So the round thing to the right, that's sort of sticking out from what seems to be the foot. It's actually sticking out from the Dishy. That's the short mast, and that's permanently attached to the Dishy, but with two little motors that actually allow it to tilt and to swivel. Now, if you intend to use your Dishy in different locations, so typical RV use or portable use for sorts, and you can only really do this on an RV subscription, because a fixed subscription will tie you down to a particular location. So one of the things that you need to know before you unpack and power the thing on is that the mast will actually tilt Dishy, and if you power it down in the wrong tilt position, then you can't get Dishy back into the box. So the trick is to put Dishy into stowage position with the Starlink app before you power Dishy down. So the Starlink app is an app on your phone that you need to configure the Wi-Fi router, anyway. And you should have that installed before you even power Dishy on. Now, once you take the foot and Dishy out of the box, you're left with about 15 meters worth of cable running from the Starlink Wi-Fi router. That's that big thing there. And it also acts as the power supply for the unit. And of course, it does also come with a power cable that you then essentially use to run the whole assembly with. And that's it. That's all that's in there. We also got ourselves a little later on an optional accessory in the form of an Ethernet adapter, which lets us bypass the Starlink Wi-Fi router for our experiments. So we can talk straight through the Dishy. So how does this Ethernet adapter work? Very, very simple. You plug the cable that comes from the Dishy and normally goes into the router. You plug that into one side of the Ethernet adapter, and noting here that you need to push the plug in the whole way into the adapter. It's a little bit difficult to do and likes to stick out. And then you plug the adapter into the Wi-Fi router with that fixed black cable on the right, and then you plug in your Ethernet device into the Ethernet port. So easy as. So, and now we're powering up. Now note that Dishy can actually get quite power hungry, over 100 watts even. This is a photo of our own measurement here. And the averages don't always apply. And there seems to be a correlation between received data rate and power use as well. Less so with transmit, surprisingly. But what I'm getting at with those power measurements here is that before you think of running this off an inverter out of your car cigarette lighter socket, you really want to check the socket's fuse rating, and you probably want an inverter that's capable of a few hundred watts continuously. Now, also at those sort of power levels, you might find it's getting a bit marginal for cigarette lighter connections. So now everything I say about directions such as north or south in the rest of this presentation will actually be from a southern hemisphere perspective and observed at a latitude of about 37 degrees south. Now, if you live in the northern hemisphere, it'll be the other way around, and observation may also differ a bit on which latitude you're at. So that comes as a bit of a disclaimer here. So after you power your Starlink setup on, what you'll notice is that Dishy will be moving into what I call the coffee table position. So it's going to be right flat on top. So incidentally, Dishy is a little top heavy. So if you're expecting to have it in windy areas on soft surfaces like grass, for example, then take a set of pegs to secure that foot. Back to the coffee table position, don't put your mug on the thing, because the next thing you'll see is Dishy rotate, and then it will tilt to the south, and that is the point at which your coffee is guaranteed to spill. So, and all of that will happen over, roughly about the first 2.5 minutes of it booting up. Now, once your Dishy has booted itself and is actually pointing the right way, which, for us means south, you can configure it using the official Starlink app, which you can get for various mobile operating systems. Now, to do so, you need to log into the Wi-Fi router, and out of the box, that router now announces itself with a network name Stinky on air. So that is in S-T-I-N-K-Y. Okay, right. So basically, Elon Musk's type of humor, right? So you can change that name though through the app, and of course you'll want a password as well. Initially it comes without a password. Now, if at any point things seem to hang, just reboot your Dishy by power cycling it, and you just do that by unplugging and unplugging it, plugging it back in again, and for waiting for it to boot. And that storage option I was talking about earlier on is actually under settings, but you'll need to scroll down a little. So at that point, it's all done, and you're pretty much ready to communicate. Log into the Wi-Fi network with your new password there, and then you can connect multiple devices and so on. So now, one of the things I wanted to find out is how well the kit would work when it was partway obstructed. So we didn't have that at Bastion Point, so I took it home and tried it in different positions over extended periods of time from our deck. Now, the good news is that it can actually cope with quite a bit of obstruction. Here, there's part of the southern sky that's obscured by my roof. What you will get are outages for up to a few seconds in that case, but you won't get complete loss of connectivity. And while connected, you seem to get the same rates that you would if there was no obstruction. Now, that said, Dishy is hell-bent to orient itself south in order to work, and it will not contemplate working with satellites in the northern sky, even if that is the only visible part of the sky. Now, that urge to point south is because this is where it can normally see the highest satellite density. If you obstruct the southern sky completely, it will just throw in the towel and stop in whatever position it looked in last. Now, if I were south of the 53rd parallel, which I'm not, obviously, I'd expect it to point north again, though, at least with the current constellation of Starlink. Now, before I give you the numbers I've observed, I need to put out a big disclaimer here. My geographical location gives me a number of whopping unfair advantages. Now, for one, Auckland is close to 3 Starlink gateways. The closest is in Clevedon, which is only about 30 kilometers away from where we tested this. Now, this means that our Dishy can essentially see the same satellites as that gateway, which provides them plenty of options for connectivity, especially while Starlink is still mostly a bent pipe system with only one satellite between me and the gateway. Now, my second advantage is that central Auckland is saturated with fiber, and it's much cheaper than Starlink while offering significantly better performance. So in the cells that we've operated in here, we've not really had much competition for Starlink satellite capacity that would have to come from users in fiberless areas further out. So our cell, our beam would have basically been pretty much without competition. So, but alas, and this is my third big advantage here, we don't actually have an overly large neighborhood. Our closest neighbor with a rural hinterland is actually Sydney on the other side of the Tasman Sea, and this is pretty much over the horizon for Starlink. It's about 2,000 kilometers away. So again, that keeps competition down. So if you were in rural Queensland or somewhere in the Philippines, for example, or in India or in Japan, that could actually be quite different. So take my numbers with a grain of salt. Your situation may be different in that respect. So last but not least, the neighborhoods that have taken most to Starlink tend to be the ones underserved by fiber. And around Auckland, that's what I would call our lifestyle block belt, which are basically semi-rural properties that are quite large and have relatively few people on them. But some of these areas have actually reached maximum user numbers for the current Starlink constellation already. So Starlink won't sell new fixed connections there, which basically means limited competition from these areas too. So with all that said, here's the summary of the speed test. And I don't really like the word speed here because we're really looking at rates and round trip times. So these are the results that we did at Bastion Point on our first outing. Now remember, we were on battery power there and we were testing a whole raft of other things too. So this is actually a small sample, but it shows just how much rates can vary. So what we're seeing here is a factor of over 3 for download and of over 3 for upload. Now this set of tests here was actually taken from my deck on that painter's trestle just over a month later. And again, we're seeing a lot of variation. In fact, over a factor of 15 in the downloads and more than 4 in the uploads. And again, for this sort of spread, it's just too small a sample still. But what both test series showed consistently, though, was high ping latency. And again, that's something that's been observed elsewhere. Of course, long latencies slow TCP down when it's trying to open its congestion window, and that's something that's undesirable. Now, that said, the latencies seen here are well below what you would see from a geostationary satellite, and also generally much lower than what you would see on an O3b medium Earth orbit system. So when you're dealing with such large latencies, then a trace route is a good way to figure out where these latencies are actually being incurred. And doing a trace route on our Starlink connection here shows that most of the latency we see is clocked up within the Starlink network. From there, via their New Zealand upstream provider and the peering exchange to us at the university, we don't actually see significant additional delay. So that latency problem is very clearly in Starlink's network, and it's caused by excess buffering in their network. That's the only cause you can really do this with, short of running extremely long cables there, right? And that's actually a well-known problem. Mike and I are regulars on the Starlink mailing list at Dave Tate's bufferbloat.net, and Dave founded the mailing list because of the buffer bloat issues he saw with Starlink. So this has been known for quite a while. So my overall conclusion at this point in time, after a bit of playing with Starlink, is that it works. It'll work even in cyclones, as seen here on the right recently during Cyclone Gabrielle, which did all this damage to New Zealand, and that it even works reasonably well in moderately obstructed locations. Now that said, even if you have no obstructions, your performance jumps around enormously, way more so than you would expect on the terrestrial network. You could get at the extreme ends anything from a mediocre ADSL rate to just over entry-level fiber with one of those RV subscriptions. But it's certainly no replacement for gigabit fiber to the home. Even the fixed service typically doesn't go over, in the vicinity of about 400 megabits per second. Now, we've observed lower maximum data rates in heavy rain, typically well under the 100 megabit per second figure. And during the recent cyclone, also strange step jumps in latency where we don't really quite know where they come from. So whether that was due to gateway reconfigurations, including possibly gateways losing power, or whether it was due to those lifestyle block belters getting disconnected after power outages, and a lot of them did, we just don't know. But it's intriguing, and as always, Starlink don't provide a running commentary on what's actually going on, and whatever commentary they do provide often doesn't actually tell us anything useful. Now, what we do know is that capacity constraints are biting even now, even in some rural areas, as we saw on that map a little earlier. And of course, then there's this entire buffer bloat issue that causes all the long latencies, and quite why they can't get on top of that is anyone's guess. So that's it from me. I could talk about this for hours, but I think I'm out of time now. Thank you.
If anyone's looked at their watch, you may realize we are running this close. So without further ado, Deepa, I'll move straight over to you if that's okay. So take it on. Again, we can share we can do the slides, but I see you're already up here with slides. So over to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So, sorry. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on low Earth orbit or LEO satellite broadband opportunities and challenges. I know the topic is a bit broader, but I'll just focus on LEO for the time's sake. So, I'm Debopam Bhattacharjee, and I work as a senior researcher at Microsoft Research India. My current research interests include LEO satellite networks, the internet architecture, and network latency. So before we start, let me quickly congratulate Philippines for already having next-gen LEO broadband coverage. This is great news. Okay, so here is the agenda of this talk. I'll first briefly touch upon the LEO height, then I'll discuss LEO network performance opportunities and bottlenecks, and then touch upon the LEO cost implications. Finally, I'll mention projects that could serve as vehicles for LEO adoption in the developing world. So let's start. When it comes to massive new space LEO networks, SpaceX Starlink and Amazon Kuiper are the larger ones. While SpaceX has already deployed more than 3,500 satellites in orbit and is offering services in more than 40 countries, Amazon is also set to start deployment soon. Note that in the visuals here, we only show the first phases of both these constellations. Various companies and startups have joined this race and have their projects at different levels of maturity. OneWeb, for example, is also actively deploying at the moment. Most of these constellations aim to offer global low latency internet coverage. At this point, one might ask already, is satellite networking old? What about HughesNet, for example, that has been serving customers for tens of years? We should note that there have been some significant changes that make new space satellite networks special. Instead of having tens of satellites, these networks plan to deploy thousands to tens of thousands. Instead of serving a few niches like satellite telephony or the aviation industry, they aim to serve the larger population by connecting them to the internet. Satellites are being deployed at low Earth orbits instead of geostationary orbits, which are significantly further away from the Earth. These changes are driven by three fantastic recent advances in space technology: reusable boosters, which come back to Earth after launching rockets, thus reducing launch costs; significant reduction in size and weight of satellites, thereby packing more satellites per launch, reducing costs; and automated link tracking, which enables inter-satellite laser communication. Products offering laser inter-satellite connectivity at 10 to 20 G at distances up to 8,000 kilometers are already available. All right, so what does LEO network performance look like? What are the performance opportunities and bottlenecks? To start with, let us see what are some key network latency implications. A geosynchronous or geosatellite has a height of 36,000 kilometers, and the minimum propagation round-trip times are hundreds of milliseconds. LEO satellites, on the other hand, fly at heights between 300 and 2,000 kilometers, thus potentially reducing propagation RTTs by more than 60x. A key feature of these constellations' promised connectivity is lower latency over distances beyond a few thousand kilometers. In this example, we are seeing a path between Zurich and Mumbai over satellites, which is quite close to the geodesic compared to fiber, which is roughly 2x longer. The speed of light being roughly 2/3 in fiber compared to free space means that the fiber path will be 3x higher latency. By the way, while inter-satellite laser, that is ISLs, are being currently rolled out, connectivity is still primarily bent pipe, that is user terminal to satellite to gateway to the internet. Note that latency improvements in LEO do come at a cost. Satellites move very fast relative to the Earth and with respect to each other. If a satellite is now over eastern Brazil, in 6 minutes, it will already reach Africa, crossing the entire Atlantic, traveling more than 450 kilometers per minute. Such highly dynamic behavior translates to continuous latency changes and links becoming infeasible in minutes. LEO motion also implies that the user terminal or node local view is also dynamic. While there are many satellite choices to connect to, such choices change quickly over time, thus leading to frequent handoffs, some of which might be suboptimal, as we'll see later. Here are screenshots of some network performance reports shared by Starlink users on social platforms. Note the differences in performance across these reports. Across Starlink speed test reports published on Reddit between Jan 21 and September 22, we see largely varying ping latencies and download speeds. The 95th percentile ping latency is 3.6 times the median latency, demonstrating significant variations in performance. We deep dived and ran active latency experiments to a nearby server from a Starlink node in the UK. The ping RTTs to the proximal server shows similar trends as in the plot we generated from the social media posts. The medians match exactly, and we could see that a large fraction of RTTs lie under 80 milliseconds. While the tail here is even longer, with RTTs higher than 5 times the median. On further investigation, we could observe intermittent latency spikes over time that persist for a while, which could be happening due to handoffs to suboptimal satellite choices. Such changes in latency happening due to satellite motion affect end-to-end transport performance. We ran different transport schemes in 5-minute interleaved slots for 30 minutes each over both LEO and the terrestrial internet. With the UDP burst, we observed the maximum achievable upload speed over LEO to be 40 megabit per second for the location at that time, and accordingly capped the terrestrial capacity. The bandwidth plot here shows that transport performance over LEO is significantly worse than over the terrestrial internet. While terrestrially, BBR V1 could achieve a median goodput of 95% of the link capacity, over Starlink LEO, it could only achieve 48%. Loss-based schemes like Cubic and New Reno perform even worse, with median goodput reaching only 28% and 23% of the capacity respectively. But why are all these observations important? We should remember that these transport performance bottlenecks impact application performance and hence user experience across all cloud applications. Just a disclaimer that I personally feel LEO broadband internet is a great revolution and could significantly improve internet adoption and connectivity in the future. But we should be careful about the network performance nuances arising due to LEO dynamicity. All right, so let us now see what are the costs of using such a service. As for performance, let us focus on Starlink for the costs as well. This table shows the current Starlink pricing across different connection types like residential, premium, RV, maritime, and aviation, and also across countries. We have collected this data from various sources, so this might not be perfect, pardon us for that. Anyway, while for residential connections, the hardware and subscription costs might seem reasonable in various countries, what are the costs like in the developing and underserved regions? In Nigeria, the one-time hardware cost is more than 200,000 naira, and the monthly subscription cost is more than 19,000 naira. In Rwanda, the monthly subscription cost is 48,000 Rwandan franc. The monthly subscription cost in Nigeria and Rwanda translate to roughly $40 US. So this is already a significant reduction compared to subscription costs in the US, that is $110 US per month. So isn't that great? Well, I'd like to remind you that in India, for example, 75% of rural Indians, the population that still lacks connectivity, lives on less than $50 a day, which translates to roughly $15 a month. So for them, buying Starlink or any other LEO connection could still be a distant dream. I believe Nigeria and Rwanda could also be facing similar fate. So while this is a great start, there is a long way to go for us. What could be some LEO adoption and deployment possibilities in the developing world? While I strongly believe there are many relevant projects across different countries, like the ones Mike briefly touched upon, let me touch upon just two of them, which could be interesting. So interesting in the sense, interesting vehicles for LEO adoption in India and even beyond in the future. The first one is Microsoft's project BlendNet. Apurv Mehra, Kashish Mittal, and team are building a low-cost satellite and intelligent edge-based technology, which delivers digital services and content to last-mile underserved users. While currently BlendNet does not support interactive applications, the LEO modality could probably augment this platform in the future in a cost-effective way. Also, Jim Forster and team run AirJaldi networks that offers low-cost internet connectivity in rural India, leveraging community Wi-Fi and public hotspots. Could LEO providers partner with such local providers to augment the community Wi-Fi solutions, thus being able to reach out to the next billion while still being a cheap solution? Well, we'll see, but these are exciting opportunities ahead. To address many of the technical and economic challenges, it is important that the industry and the academic research community come closer together to build a LEO consortium. Toward this, I have been co-organizing multiple LEOCon events. The ongoing one, LEOCon WS, is a webinar series where we host speakers giving interesting tech talks on LEO networks. To get updates and participate for free, visit the LEOCon WS webpage and please subscribe. Let me quickly thank my current collaborators on LEO before I conclude my talk. Thanks everyone for listening and for giving me this wonderful opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Deepapam. And a round of applause for our speakers, please. It's a difficult circumstance to do this remotely. Now, we do have around 3 minutes for questions. So if there are anyone with questions, please jump up to the microphone and state your name before you ask. And while I'm waiting for someone to jump up, I have one myself. And it's basically addressed to you, Mike. You started with the most challenging question of all. There are 4 billion unconnected. And you pointed out that the various ways we've tried to address that requires an enormous amount of capital, and it doesn't make a big impact into that 4 billion number. Are LEOs part of the answer, all of the answer, or are we looking in the wrong place? Deepa Balm seems to suggest there are ways to make this bigger, but your question is still in my head. Those 4 billion trouble me. Do they trouble you still?
Thank you, Geoff, for the question. It's a great question. And the number one learning from operating in Africa has been that anybody that claims we are going to connect the unconnected, we're going to connect the next 4 billion or the next billion or the next 500 million is I mean, they're just not right, because they will not be able to do it by themselves, because at the end, and as Deepa Balm says, people living on $15 a month, that needs a completely radically different view on the whole technology and the whole financial stack. And it's not just about technology, there's the financial aspect as well, and there's taxation and there's FX rates, and there's so many things that play into it, that my message to the world and to the planet would be, everybody needs to think radically different, everybody needs to align, everybody needs to think longer term. This is no longer paybacks of 2-3 years, we're into 10-15 years. And we just need to look things through completely different lens and take radically different approaches. And LEO definitely is an element into this. I think it's going to be a very, very big part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. There's other things that also need to happen.
Thank you. And I have someone at the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Rasodeka Harada. I'm a CCTLD administrator of .pg from Papua New Guinea. My question is very simple. Since September 11 last year, our fiber optic cable from Guam to Medan has cut it off, and almost 3 months without internet. Only solution is a satellite. We at the University of Technology, we have a redundancy backup from O3B. You see this O3B, over 3 billion people. We are the first largest customer of O3B in this country, in that country, Papua New Guinea. But my question to your panel is very simple. Currently, over 4 billion people, let's say O4B. So how soon this Elon Musk Starlink can reduce a number like O2B, O1B, or till 0? Do you have any idea? And is it good for rural people, not city people? What's your opinion and suggestion? Thank you.
Don't all rush to speak at once.
I'm happy to take that.
Ulrich,
Yeah. So basically, looking at the number of satellites that the constellations have proposed to put into space, looking at the number of sort of technological scale up that they've promised in terms of, you know, the amount of throughput per satellite and stuff like that, and also the spectral constraints around what is going into space, I would say we can count ourselves lucky if they're going to be able to get internet service to a few 100 million. And my guess would be that most of those few 100 million would be people who are already pretty well off and who can afford the subscriptions. And then in some areas, you know, they might be able to supply some, you know, people who are maybe not that well off, but that'll be sort of a, you know, probably marginal social service on the side of things. Where it's really making a big difference is when you're trying to bring connectivity in an area into an area that's completely unconnected. And we actually saw this here last week after the cyclone moved through. There was a town of 5,000 people in the, near the New Zealand East Coast, Wairoa, which was literally completely cut off in all means and all ways from the world, road, power, any kind of communication was down, and somebody had a Starlink kit and a generator, and they were able after 3 hours to get back in touch with the world. And so this is where Starlink can make a good difference. But in terms of reducing the billions to single digit, or even 2 billion figures, I don't think this is going to come from space.
Deepa Balm?
Yeah, so I kind of want to diverge, and I come back to your question, Geoff, on the 4 billion people who are still unconnected. So I personally think, and is it fine to do that? Yeah, okay, all right. So I personally think that, you know, it's not only about the network and the capabilities, it's also about the applications. So a person connecting to the internet for the first time, what applications would that person benefit from, right? So we have to think about it. Digital work, education, skilling, entertainment, what is that? So I think a lot depends on that. Some applications could be served well by GEO and MEO satellites, and these are very good broadcasting, multicasting media, right? So that might reduce the cost significantly. So together, GEO, MEO, and LEO satellites could serve different types of applications and still be cost effective in the future, hopefully. So we really need to take into consideration the applications that we want to serve over these constellations.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
The time is now at the top of the hour, so I will wrap this up. But firstly, I want to thank our speakers again. The inner nerd in me is totally fascinated by this kind of space technology. You know, I was, I suppose, honored to live through the US space program. I watched every launch. I was hooked. And to see this into fruition is truly amazing. So I, for one, will be watching this with fascination for the rest of my life, and I'm sure for the rest of yours. This is transformative stuff, and it's amazing technology. So thank you very much for giving us an insight into this, and thank you for the audience for working through. We'll take a break now. The next session will be on in half an hour from now. Thank you indeed. Thank you.